The first Mennonites had arrived in Russia in 1789 with little to nothing. Here in South Russia, now Ukraine, the Mennonites kept their heads down and worked hard. By 1911, the Mennonites owned over 50% of the milling industry and were responsible for producing 10% of the region's agricultural implements. The Tsar's government saw the Mennonites as model farmers and sponsored them to apprentice Ukrainian and Jewish farmers, as well as the nomadic Nogai Tatars, so they could adopt Mennonite practices and replicate their success. At the turn of the century, one Mennonite, Gerhard Lorenz, described the Mennonite colonies as like an oasis in the steppes. However, with success came envy. Not everyone appreciated the Mennonites' contributions and prosperity, which had been the case for centuries. As Helmut Hubert wrote, prosperity in the Mennonite areas brought them respect for their industry and skill, but also generated envy and resentment among their neighbors. Sean Patterson wrote, largely unaware of the coming storm, the Mennonites built their commonwealth as an oasis in the dry steppe, a city on the hill for all to envy. But in 1917, the Mennonites' golden age in Russia came to a sudden end. In November 1917, the Marxist Bolsheviks took over Russia by a forceful revolution. The Bolsheviks were a radical left-wing political party who established a socialist government. With the goal of eliminating inequalities by any means necessary, the Bolsheviks labeled the more prosperous peasants in Russia as kulaks, meaning privileged farmers, because they insisted, according to Marxist doctrine, that the kulaks' greater relative productivity and wealth was conclusive evidence that they were robbing, exploiting, and oppressing the less wealthy peasants around them. In November, the Bolsheviks officially adopted the policy to liquidate the kulaks called dekulakization. To accomplish their mandate of equality and the deliverance of justice, Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Party, called for nationwide violence against the millions of peasants classified as kulaks, a classification which included Mennonites. Lenin declared ruthless war on the kulaks, death to them, ruthless suppression of the kulaks, those bloodsuckers, vampires, plunderers of the people. Lenin instructed, rob the robber. You peasants, you workmen, were robbed by the wealthy people. Now get back everything that you have lost. Take everything that you see and do not care about what you do. This violent revolutionary rhetoric fomented murderous envy and resentment towards peasants who had a little more wealth. It created a victimhood mentality and a lust for vengeance. This began a Marxist class struggle all across Russia. In the book Reflections on a Ravaged Century, Robert Conquest wrote, thereafter, a Marxist conception of class struggle led to an almost totally imaginary class categorization being inflicted in the villages, where peasants with a couple of cows or 5 or 6 acres more than their neighbors were now labeled kulaks and a class war against them declared. The millions of Russian peasants who were labeled kulaks were not classified according to objective criteria, but instead were classified opportunistically by their neighbors and state officials. In his book, The Volga Germans, Fred Koch wrote, the owner of a single cow, no matter how aged or scrawny she was, might find himself so labeled by a proletarian accuser, particularly if the latter wanted the cow. Lenin's pronouncement gave every burglar, thief, robber, extortionist, and swindler license from the highest authority in the land to seize another's property and goods with impunity. The great mass of people in the colonies who had accumulated anything at all in material things during a lifetime of industry, good management, and frugality were now declared prey for freebooting and criminal elements. With the Civil War raging, law and order had completely broken down, and dozens of smaller revolutionary factions roamed freely, pillaging and killing, eagerly following Lenin's instructions. The Mennonite historian Gerhard Lorenz wrote that these bands roamed the country, claiming to be fighters of freedom and justice, but in reality were nothing more than the scum of society, and aiming at nothing better than plunder, murder, and rape. In his book Fire over Zagradovka, Gerhard wrote, "Soon the Ukraine was in flames. Practically nightly one could see the reddened sky reflecting fires. The estates and the homes of the well-to-do were burning. One did not need a particularly active imagination to surmise what was going on in these places: rape and murder, and senseless destruction of valuable property." But of all these smaller revolutionary factions, the Mennonites most feared the Makhnovists. Named after their leader, Nestor Makhno, the Makhnovists were an anarcho-communist army who fought for the elimination of the class state and economic inequalities, and to introduce an economic and social system based on the principles of social equality, justice, and fraternity. Although their slogans of equality and justice may have seemed praiseworthy and righteous, their actions would prove otherwise. In his memoir, Bernhard Dick gives a description of the typical raid that Mennonite villages suffered through in 1917 and 18. The bandits always grabbed the men first. At first, the men were severely tortured in order to obtain money, gold, silver, and other valuables, if such were still available, and then they were either killed or tied up helplessly. After the bandits had robbed the house, the women were locked up and victimized. Inconceivably sad, but so true. The temptation to form an emergency Selbstschutz, self-defense unit, did not arise suddenly overnight, but grew in our men gradually through months of unbearable and catastrophic experiences and unprecedented terror. There was, for example, a 30-year-old, sincerely devout married man, a certain HP, who told me that it had become quite clear to him where his duty lay when he saw in Halbstad the first abused women from the German Lutheran village of Preistab who were bleeding and whose breasts had been cut off. His one and only thought was, "I've got to get home and grab a rifle." Another Mennonite stated that he joined the self-defense unit because he must protect his mother and other village women from Makhno and his bandits. Given their pacifist tradition, Mennonites became divided over the action of self-defense. However, small self-defense units were formed for the prevention of murder and rape. The Chortasa Mennonite colony established a self-defense unit similar to this one, with 250 men, 18 of whom were from Eichenfeld, who fought alongside other German colonists and successfully repelled waves of bandit attacks. However, in 1919, the Bolshevik Red Army and the Makhnovists, both communist armies, entered into an alliance to defeat the volunteer White Army, considered conservative and right-wing. And in September, the Makhnovists won a critical victory against the White Army, giving them complete control over a huge area of land, which included 5 Mennonite colonies: Chortasa, Molochtina, Yasikovo, Zagradovka, and Borisenko. The prominent Makhnovist Peter Oshanov described this takeover. They literally swept through the villages, towns, and cities like an enormous broom. Kulaks perished in great numbers. By late October, Makhnovists were once again pillaging Mennonite colonies. In addition to the looting and killing was mass rape. John Toes wrote that by 1920, at least 100 women and girls who had suffered such violations were still being treated for syphilis in Chortasa alone. Similar conditions existed in the Molochtina. Eichenfeld resident David Quiring wrote, "Thank you so much for watching. This clip was taken from my Eichenfeld Massacre documentary, which you can find right here." If you liked this video, then you will probably enjoy some of my other videos on the Anabaptists, so be sure to check out my YouTube channel. Also, I ask that you please consider supporting my work on Patreon, where you can reach out to me and where all my videos are ad-free. Whether you pledge $1, $10, or whatever you can spare, it really does help me to cover the costs that go into making these videos.